Good evening. I'm Jerry Shakeshaft in political science, your referee for the evening. One of the truly valuable assets of this university is its lectures committee, an extremely hard-working group of people who, with generous financing from the government of the student body, has greatly enriched and enhanced the learning experience of us all, young and old. I can say that with complete impunity, having never been a member of the committee and having no desire to be. In the past year alone, for example, it has brought, just to name a few, to this campus, I.F. Stone, Anthony Lewis, the great economist Paul Sweezy, William Kunstler, and a host of distinguished scientists, as well as its sponsorship of a World Affairs Institute and a National Affairs Institute, and a first-rate Shakespeare symposium to be held next week. Later this year, it will help sponsor an annual Law Day observance, which this year will have Robert C. Weaver in a discussion of Brown versus the Board of Education a quarter of a century later. One of the shortcomings of the university, among both faculty and student body, is that they avail themselves so little of these truly valuable assets. These remarks are made as a plea by an old teacher that students make greater use of this lecture series, which, if you'll give it a try, can often be more exciting than the classroom. The committee has never backed off from difficult subjects or people either, and certainly tonight is no exception. Our guest this evening is Mr. Mark Lane, who with Mr. Charles Gary was one of two attorneys for Reverend James Jones, present at the bizarre set of tragedies at Port Kaituma, Georgetown, and Jonestown, Guyana, on November 18th and 19th, which resulted in the murder of Congressman Leo Ryan and 5 of his companions, 4 deaths in Georgetown, and the mass suicide of over 900 members of the People's Temple in Jonestown. Mr. Lane is here to talk about those events. Mr. Lane is a member of the Bar of the 2nd Judicial District, or Judicial Department of New York City, being a graduate of the Brooklyn College of Law. After service in the U.S. Army and his graduation from law school, he practiced law in New York City for 10 years. He founded the Mid-Harlem Community Parish Narcotics Clinic in 1953 and the East Harlem Reform Democratic Club in 1959. From 1960 to 1962, he served as a member of the New York State Assembly in Albany, during which time he was arrested in the South for civil rights demonstrations, including 2 arrests with Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. During the Vietnam War, he founded the Covered Wagon of Mountain Home, Idaho, a counseling service for conscientious objectors. He organized the Wounded Knee Legal Defense Offense Committee while defending Dennis Banks to a victory in an important case involving prosecutorial misconduct. Mr. Lane has written 7 books, among them the bestseller Rush to Judgment, which questioned the procedures and findings of the Warren Commission investigating the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, and the most recent of which is Codename Zorro, co-authored with Dick Gregory about the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. He founded the Citizens Commission of Inquiry, which lobbied for the creation of a Congressional Select Committee on Assassinations, at which, as you know, last year, he appeared as counsel for James Earl Ray. The person introducing Mr. Lane, as well as the Committee on Lectures, is not unmindful of the strong allegations against Mr. Lane, his activities, and his writing by members of his own profession and by reputable authorities in assorted magazines and newspapers. These are matters which he can handle for himself in more appropriate settings than this hall, although he has agreed to answer questions at the end. This is a great institution of openness and light, and Mr. Lane is here at the invitation of a major committee of that institution. 1 week after Jonestown, that redoubtable lover of San Francisco, Herb Caen of the San Francisco Chronicle, wrote about the rush to discuss and analyze the meaning of those events, and he presented the only questions which can give real significance to the appearance of any speaker on the subject. Caen wrote, "All manner of cults and cultists were discussed in print and during the inevitable talk shows. But from the Reverend Moon to Esalen, from communism to fascism and back again, nothing and nobody seems to provide a final clue to the mystery of the Reverend James Jones. His almost religious and definitely mystical power, its evil well concealed, must somehow be construed as a clue to the mystery that is the 1970s. But the meaning remains hidden by masks of personal motives, distant exotic regions, and finally, death. It is to these mysteries that Mr. Lane has been asked to address himself here this evening. Mr. Mark Lane."
Thank you. I'm not quite sure about the implication in part of the gentleman's introduction to me, but at the conclusion of my remarks, I will be happy to take any questions that any of you may have on any question whatsoever. Just feel free when I conclude to ask me about any of the disinformation which has been published in the news media through handouts by the intelligence organizations to the national media, and I'll be happy to discuss it with you in great detail. The implication given to the American people by the national news media, and even in the introduction this evening, and by Herb Caen, referred to in the introduction, that 900 people, no doubt mesmerized, no doubt robots, followed the Pied Piper for no reason that any normal person can understand, thousands of miles away from the place of their birth, into Jonestown, Guyana, for reasons beyond our comprehension, and then at the word of the leader, all just agreed to commit suicide, certainly does paint a bizarre picture, the picture which has been presented to us by the national news media. And if that were all true, none of it is, if that were all true, then it would certainly be difficult for us to identify with those who left home for reasons which are beyond our comprehension, and who committed suicide when the leader said to do so. At the law, there is an understanding that when you talk to the jury, and the concept of the reasonable man, they used to say, I hope now they're saying reasonable person in the courts, but when the concept of what the courts over the years have referred to as the reasonable man comes up, each juror thinks, reasonable man? That's me. What would I have done under those circumstances? None of us can identify with those who, when told by Jim Jones to commit suicide, do it just like that. It is so bizarre. It is beyond our comprehension. And thus the national news media, publishing intelligence handouts from the United States government and little else about Jonestown, has divided us from 900 of our sisters and brothers who traveled from these shores, almost all of whom, over 80% of whom were black, almost 90% of whom were women, who left these shores in search of the realization of a dream which they had concluded, many of them in their long, long lives in the ghettos of Fillmore and the ghettos of Watts, was not realizable for them in the country in which they were born. That is not such a difficult concept. Mr. Kane is wrong. It is not all that mysterious to understand why people living 50, 60, 70 years, 80 years, 90 years, some of them, in the ghettos of the large cities of this country, treated as second-class citizens, denied a decent education, seeing their children denied a decent education, denied decent medical care, would listen to someone who would say, we can build our own community, we can build our own schools, we can build our own hospitals and our own medical systems to care for all of us. Their dream turned into a nightmare, and by November 18th of last year, almost all of them perished. But the reasons that they fled from these shores should not be beyond us, because there remain millions of people in this country, the people to whom Dr. King addressed himself in the last months of his life in a plea for economic justice, to change the economic structure of this society so that a third of the nation would not go to sleep hungry, so that high school graduates in Watts and Fillmore would not be functionally illiterate, even though they had their certificate indicating they had graduated from high school. The reasons they left her are clear. There's no mystery about them. And the manner in which they died is also susceptible to proof. If they all committed suicide, we cannot identify with them. None of us believes that we would have done that. And therefore, we are talking about humanoids or robots. If, as the national news media says, they committed suicide. What does the United States government know? What does the news media, relying upon government handouts about what took place there, know about what took place there? How curious was the United States government to discover what happened there? The first message from the United States State Department to the government of Guyana, after learning that 900 Americans had died there, was dig a big trench and dump all of their bodies in there. How curious our government was. No autopsy, no investigation. The United States State Department suggested what would have been literally a most grisly cover-up of the evidence in the case. And the Guyanese said, no, we are offended by your suggestion. These were your citizens. Take their bodies home and bury them where their relatives can visit them, can visit the cemeteries. And only because the Guyanese insisted was that huge trench directed by the State Department not dug for the bodies there. The bodies were brought back to this country. Leading forensic pathologists in America, among them Dr. Cyril Wecht of Pittsburgh, former president of the American Society of Forensic Pathologists, and others, demanded that autopsies be conducted on the bodies so that we would know what took place, how they died, perhaps secure some clues as to how they died. All of those offers were rejected by the United States government, and the bodies were sent to an Air Force base in Dover, Delaware, where only high-ranking military physicians were permitted to examine the bodies, just as only high-ranking military physicians were permitted to conduct the autopsy on President Kennedy's body some 15 years before, almost to the day. The value of that military autopsy at the Bethesda Naval Hospital in 1963 has been assessed by a committee of experts since that time. An autopsy which told us nothing because high-ranking physicians under the control of higher-ranking officers who were not even physicians covered up the evidence in their very autopsy about the death of President Kennedy. That is the testimony now, that terrible record. And again now, we had a similar occurrence in Jonestown with the victims being brought back. 913 bodies. Do you know how many autopsies were conducted? 2 months later, 7 autopsies. That's all. Only 7. The United States government waited so long to recover the bodies from the floor of that jungle, that rainforest in tropical Guyana, that many of the bodies began to explode before they were picked up, to disintegrate, some of them, so that even today hundreds of the bodies cannot be identified because the government waited so long. And it is this government which in its press releases, its handouts to the news media, has assured us that there was a mass suicide there. I think it's more important to look at the evidence rather than the speculation of the United States government about how the people died there. There was a medical examiner, one, who examined the bodies in place, the medical examiner of Guyana. And in his testimony before a court of competent jurisdiction in Georgetown, he testified that of the 900 who died, over 700 had been murdered, and of that there was no question based upon his own investigation. There was one American investigator, Louis Gurvich, whose young daughter, a law student, Jan Gurvich, died in Jonestown, who went actually into Georgetown, from Georgetown over the objection of the American military presence, which was there, but with the support of the Police Commission of Guyana, was able to examine the bodies in place. An experienced private investigator licensed by the state of Louisiana, a man who for a quarter of a century has been a private investigator, who heads a staff of some 300 in Louisiana, and it was his conclusion in investigating the bodies in place, on the scene, that the majority had been murdered. In addition to that, there is the eyewitness testimony of just two men, who were present when the massacre began. And their testimony supports the conclusion that many, many people were murdered. Stanley Clayton of Chicago, for example, testified before a grand jury, a federal grand jury in San Francisco, that he was there when the murders began, and when Jim Jones began to talk about the need for everyone to die, and people were gathered together in this pavilion, surrounded by a perimeter of men armed with semi-automatic weapons pointed in at the crowd, and others with crossbows pointed at the crowd, that when he talked about the need to die, people protested. Christine Miller stood up and objected, said, "You have no right to kill us. We were talking about going to the Soviet Union." And he ordered that she be silenced. 20 to 30 armed guards surrounded her. When she would not be silenced, she was held down and poison was injected into her arm. The New York Times calls that suicide. So does CBS. Children, according to these two witnesses, Odell Rhodes, Stanley Clayton, the only two eyewitnesses who actually saw the murders, who came out, survived, came out and talked about it. Children were ripped from their parents' arms. Their parents were held, protesting, screaming. The children were screaming, and when the children were taken away, poison was injected into their mouths. That's the eyewitness testimony. The only two eyewitnesses and the only two experts. And what they have to say tends to corroborate what each of them says. And yet the news media tells us there was a mass suicide. If it was not a suicide, and it was not, then it's perhaps easier for us to begin to identify with those who died there and examine the reasons for their death. The news media has painted a picture in which I have been not only a dear friend of Jim Jones, a lifelong associate, the attorney for the People's Temple, but probably the founding bishop of the religion. In September of last year, 2 months before the massacre, I had never heard of Jim Jones, People's Temple, or Jonestown, Guyana. Never heard of them. That occasion, I was invited to do what I am doing here this evening, to go to Jonestown and to present a talk on the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And I went there, and when I arrived there, I met Jim Jones for the first time, and it was 2 months, almost to the day, before he and so many others died. And Jim Jones was trembling. He told me there was a governmental plan to destroy him and to destroy Jonestown. And as we look back now, we see what led him to that conclusion and why he was so frightened. We'll go into those details in just a bit. But what he did tell me is that he was terrified that there would be some provocation, a governmental provocation, to prevent them from taking what seemed to be to them the only logical step available to them in the desperate situation in which they found themselves. What was that situation? They had gone to Jonestown and had heroically cleared out 3,000 acres of a previously unexplored jungle, almost by hand, with the hope that with all of the sun and all of the rain, this was a tropical area in the middle of a rainforest, that they could grow anything. They could sustain life there. And the vast majority of the people who went there were not young people. Most of them were so old they were incapable of the work that was required in Jonestown to sustain life. And some of them were very small children, leaving a minority of able-bodied people, teenagers to their late 50s. And they did the basic hard work, and they worked many long hours to try to sustain a society which was becoming an agricultural society there. But they failed. They failed because no matter how hard they worked, the earth was not fertile, and they could not produce what was required for life. They could grow banana trees, some cassava plants, but very little beside that. And so the burden fell upon Jim Jones to provide a means of survival, food, medicine. And it cost him, from the coffers which he had developed over the years, approximately $500,000 a year to keep that project going. And when that was, they would import rice, and that kept it going at a bare minimum level of subsistence. They brought in rice from Georgetown, 25 hours away by steamer through a jungle stream, which meant that on many days people ate rice 3 times a day. Medicine was required because there were a lot of elderly people with a lot of serious problems. And he realized that the project was a dead end. There was no way it could survive. It had failed as an agricultural project, basically because they were not familiar with the problems that they would encounter. They brought in cattle, thought that beef would be certainly, raising cattle there would be one way for survival. It was very hard even to have grass grow because of the conditions. When it rained, it washed away the seeds. It was torrential downpours. And they tried, they terraced, they did everything. And finally they grew grass. They brought cattle in. The cattle grazed on the grass, but there were tropical parasites in the grass, and the cattle died. They brought in pigs, and at night vampire bats flew into the piggery and ate the nipples off of the nursing sows. They brought in chickens, but found that it was too expensive to bring in food for the chickens because there was nothing which they could raise there to feed the chickens with. In every respect, it was an agricultural fiasco and disaster, and they could not survive. Knowing that, last year, Jones asked his aide, Terry Buford, to send a letter to the relevant intelligence organizations of the United States, which said, in essence, we have failed. Now, Jim Jones had proclaimed his area, his organization, to be a communist organization. Make no mistake about that. He said that we are living as Marxists here in Jonestown. He was very critical of American foreign policy, taking what he considered to be a Marxist line and analyzing American foreign policy. They had abolished the use of money in Jonestown. If you needed a medical examination, you just went to the doctor. If you needed soap, you went to someone who made soap. If you needed clothing, you went to the elderly people who sewed clothing. No money was ever exchanged. People who could work, worked. People who could not, did not. And those who required clothing, shelter, food, whatever, it was made available by the community. Now, Jim Jones thought that this was a sophisticated Marxist community which had been developed there. I can tell you that in my one philosophical discussion with Mr. Jones back in September of last year, I concluded that he would have had great difficulty distinguishing between the writings of Karl Marx and Groucho Marx. But he nevertheless did proclaim himself to be a Marxist who had developed a Marxist society. He said he was at one with the communist world. He was frightened, therefore, about returning back to the United States. And he said this. He said, to bring 1,000 people back who've lived for a year as communists, been critical of American foreign policy, to bring them back to America without some guarantees by the intelligence organizations may be to subject them to terrible harassment. He thought of another organization, which proclaimed itself to be a Marxist-Leninist organization, the Black Panther Party. And not just the harassment of that organization, but the murder of its leaders in Chicago and other cities by conspiracies of the federal police organizations and local police organizations. He was deeply concerned that similar things would happen to the members of the People's Temple where they would return to California. And so letters were dispatched. Director of the FBI, Director of the CIA, the President of the United States, State Department, saying, we failed. We'd like to come home. Promise us there will be no harassment, and we will return. And Jim Jones will pull an Eldridge Cleaver, was the phrase in the letters. He'll go on a lecture tour for the State Department. He will say, communism does not work. We tried it and it doesn't work. It's not the right time for it. America is the greatest country in the world. No one should ever leave home. Whatever you want, we will say it. Let us come home. Promise us there'll be no harassment of the people from the community. There was never a response in the many, many months that passed from any of the intelligence organizations or from the State Department. Jones felt that the failure to receive a response was, in fact, a response. He could no longer stay in Guyana. It was a dead-ended project. People were unhappy. Food was terrible. People were becoming ill because of lack of sufficient vitamins. And so he looked around and thought that there was another place perhaps he might go. And he sent a delegation to the Soviet embassy in Georgetown and asked if they would agree to allow the 1,000 Americans to immigrate to the Soviet Union, not as a people's temple. He understood that the structure of the Soviet Union was not sufficiently flexible to allow a cult to exist somewhere in the middle of it. But can we break up, stay together in family groups and groups of friends and live in different cities and undertake jobs? People would learn skills in Jonestown, metal workers and woodworkers and others. Can we become part of the Soviet society? The Russians, of course, were intrigued. Of course, the ambassador to Guyana from the Soviet Union had no authority to respond directly to the question except to say that we will forward the information to Moscow. But of course, they had to be intrigued. As President Carter talks about human rights, as this being the one country which guarantees it to all of its citizens, welcoming the Katz family and others from the Soviet Union, making much ado about the Sharansky family in the Soviet Union. Just think if 1,000 Americans, 80% of whom were black, traveled to the Soviet Union saying we could not find human rights in our own country, in the United States, and we're exploring the possibility of securing them in the Soviet Union. Can you think of the propaganda nightmare for the United States government, not just the first day when they landed, but 6 months later, and the black woman who became an expert metal worker, machine worker, who I met in Jonestown, who was taught by an elderly white man who had retired from the Union years before, who could say with all sincerity, if she arrived in Moscow, if she was given a job there as a machine worker, I could never achieve this position in the United States. First of all, I'm black. Secondly, I'm a woman. And thirdly, my father was not a member of the Union. So how could I ever become a machine worker in the city where I was born? But here she was working at a machine in the Soviet Union. You can see ongoing stories for a long, long time. First anniversary, how are the 1,000 Americans doing there? This was a propaganda nightmare. And Jones was aware of that, felt that the United States government would try to do something to prevent that from taking place, from that great immigration. Well, the response came from the Soviet embassy in Georgetown. We're interested. Send another delegation. So another delegation went to the Soviet embassy in Georgetown, and the matter was explored even more deeply. And then an invitation was passed out. We'd like you to send the first wave to Moscow, 50 people to Moscow. to make contacts in the Soviet Union, to explore the matter further, of everyone moving there. And the date set the first days of December of last year. Of course, the visit never took place because almost everyone in Jonestown died during the middle of November of last year. But that was the plan. And when during the first days of November, Jim Jones received a message from Congressman Leo Ryan of San Mateo, California, that he was going to head a congressional investigation into Jonestown, Jones panicked. He panicked, and he felt this was the effort of the United States government to provoke some kind of a response, to prevent that trip to the Soviet Union, to prevent what he saw as their salvation. Jones was ill at that time, ill and under very heavy medication. And when I was there in September, he had asked me to do one thing, to bring a Freedom of Information action under that newly amended act, so that they could have some understanding about what the government was doing, whether or not they had been infiltrated. Someone had come on the very day before I met him for the first time in September, through the American Embassy. Joe Mazer, private investigator, California, said he had worked with Interpol, was given the assignment by the American Embassy to count the passports in there, he said. And when he went up to Jim Jones that day, he said, the Central Intelligence Agency has infiltrated your organization. They are here in Jonestown. CIA is here. And Jones was driven besides himself with panic. He said, who are they? And Mr. Mazer said, I cannot tell you who they are. He said, I can tell you something else. Remember the time a few months ago when shots were fired in here from the perimeter? And Jones said, yes. He said, that was an assassination attempt at you, and it was directed by people in American intelligence. Now, whether or not it is true that there was an effort directed at Jones by American intelligence, I do not know. Whether or not it is true that the Central Intelligence Agency had infiltrated Jonestown, I do not know. But there was someone coming through the auspices of the American Embassy, giving that information to Jim Jones. And whether it was true or not, it drove Jones, in his fragile state of mind, in his poor health, closer to that fine line which separates those who are sane from those who are insane. And when I met him, he was panicked and fearful and trembling. And he said, there is this plan. They have people right in here. And I said, well, you know, you can deal with this under the law. Freedom of Information action. It may take a little while, but we can get some information. If there's anybody in here working for the CIA, we ought to be able to get that information, bring an action to the federal court in the United States, and have the person leave. Don't have to worry about anyone taking that kind of action against you, because we can find out in all probability, as we did in the Kennedy case, the Kennedy assassination, as we did in the King assassination. Get documents which will reveal things which we did not previously know. And so I had agreed to do that one thing, and I was beginning work on that when the People's Temple office in San Francisco contacted me during the early days of November of last year and said, Jim Jones would like you to do one more thing. And I said, what's that? He said, well, they got a message from Congressman Ryan that he's heading a congressional investigation into Jonestown, and he would like you to urge the congressman not to go. And I said, all right. I called Congressman Ryan's office immediately, from my home in Memphis, Tennessee, to San Mateo, California, knowing that it was around election time and the congressman would not be in Washington. And he was not, but he was not in his office, and he never did call me back, and so I wrote a letter to him. And within a day or two, I received a telephone call from Jim Scollard of the House International Relations Committee telling me that he was an aide to Congressman Ryan. He was planning to go on the trip with him. I said, what would the delegation consist of? And he said, 2 members of Congress, Congressman Ryan and 1 aide, and Congressman Derwinski, a Republican on the committee, and 1 aide, just the 4 of them. And I said, Mr. Scollard, Jim Jones sees this as the same thing that I said to Congressman Ryan in the letter. He sees this as a provocation. And I told him that Jones might consider going to another country precipitously if this was to take place, and this would be very embarrassing for the United States. And I urged him not to go. I told him that Jim Jones was ill and under medication. I said, this is the least propitious time for such a visit. And his answer was, I'll raise that with the congressman and let you know. And he did, and later called me back and said, no, the congressman's going to go anyway. And I said, let me tell you, The dates you're talking about are going to Georgetown on November 14th, into Jonestown on November 16th. Now, Mr. Jones has asked that I be there with you all when that trip is made. I said November 16th is the day that James Earl Ray is to testify before the House Select Committee on Assassinations in Washington. You know that. You've seen that on television. You've seen it reported in the press. I'm his attorney. I must be there with him. And so I asked you if you can at least put off the visit for 2 weeks so I can take care of that matter and then move into the next one. He said he would raise that with Congressman Ryan, and he did, and the answer was no. Congressman Ryan is going on the 14th. He'll be in Jonestown on the 16th, and that's all there is to it. I communicated that information back to the People's Temple office in San Francisco, and they had direct contact with Jim Jones by radio, amateur radio, from San Francisco to Jonestown. That was the only direct way of communicating with Jonestown. And the answer by Jim Jones was, well, that was terrible, and he really didn't want this visit at this time. Wasn't there some way to put it off? And he came up with a series of suggestions to tell Congressman Ryan. Number one, this was a communist organization, and they wanted people representing different political viewpoints from the Congress. And I explained to the People's Temple personnel in San Francisco that if this was the French Parliament or the Italian Parliament and you wanted equal representation of communists and non-communists, that could be arranged with the United States Congress. That was very difficult to work out. And they wanted an equal number of members of the Black Caucus, black members of Congress. And I said, well, you can't pick the committee that investigates you. And Jones was coming up with desperate ideas about how to stall off the visit, and most of them, it seemed to me, would not have been persuasive to Congress and did not make an awful lot of sense, and the reasons which I offered to the Congress I thought did. He was entitled to be represented by an attorney of his choice. He chose me. I could not be there that day. That was one of the reasons. In any event, Jones decided that maybe he would let them in, 2 members of Congress and 2 aides, and maybe they could deal with the problems at that time. And I said, is that who's coming, Mr. Scarlett? 2 members of Congress and 2 aides. And he said, yes, that's all, I assure you. Then I received a telephone call from Don Harris, who was a friend of mine at NBC Television. We had done some work together on the NBC programs, network programs, which he had produced about the assassination of Dr. King, and that was in the previous months. And he called and said, Mark, are you going to be involved in this one too with me? I said, what is that, Don? And he said, well, we're all going to Jonestown together, aren't we? I said, you're going to Jonestown with who? And he said, well, with Congressman Ryan. We've been invited to go. I'm bringing a whole film crew with me. And I said, I just talked to the congressman's office, and they tell me 2 members of Congress and 2 aides and nobody else. He said, no, look, a lot of the news media is going down there. And I called back Mr. Scarlett and told him what Mr. Harris had told me, and he said, no, he's wrong. He said, maybe he's flying down to Georgetown from New York City. Pan Am is a public carrier. Anybody can buy a ticket on that plane. But I assure you that they are not going anywhere near Jonestown. They're staying in Georgetown. So that information was communicated back to Jim Jones, and he was reassured again, 2 members of Congress and 2 aides, and that was going to be the delegation. Just prior to then, last day of November, a woman named Terry Buford, a brilliant young graduate of the University of California School of Journalism, who had been with Jim Jones's organization for some 7 years and who I'd met in Jonestown in the 2 days that I was there in September, defected from People's Temple and called me. She called me because when I spoke with her on the way back from Jonestown to Georgetown, I raised serious questions about what I saw there. The press, in fact, a reporter here this evening said, didn't you say that Jonestown was a utopian paradise and a socialist paradise? The answer is no. I never did say anything related to that. In fact, I raised very serious criticism with People's Temple leadership and with Terry Buford in great detail when we had an opportunity to talk about it, when she was the 2nd-ranking leader in People's Temple back in September of last year. I said, you know, I come to Jonestown and I hear that it's a society which is struggling against the standards of our own in America. And then I see the ruling group in Jonestown, white, college-educated, professionally trained, middle class. And I see the people, poor, working class, black, poorly educated. And I said, this is not, I don't see a society which is built as a contrast to the American society, but one which, unfortunately, too closely reflects the very problems in the United States. And I raised other problems which I had seen there. I said, you know, when I first heard about this place called Jonestown and heard it was a white minister, most of the people were black in the congregation, it's a white minister named Jones, and it was named after him. It seemed a little odd to me. I understand you have a nuclear plant around here with a similar disability, but named after the person who's still around. It always raises questions in my mind as to propriety, as a matter of fact, and more than that. But it was because I had raised these questions and because she, Terry Buford, when she defected, did not want to become an opponent of People's Temple at Jonestown, but wanted to talk to someone who was looking at the thing quite realistically, someone to whom she could confide the problems. And she did. She came to see me the last day of October of last year. And she told me about some of the problems in there. And she said, the worst thing in the world, the worst thing is a confrontation. That would be the worst thing that could happen. And I was inclined to agree with her based upon my analysis then. I'm inclined to agree with that position now based upon everything that we know. It's incredible, it seems to me, that the news media has been relatively successful in trying to convince the American people that somehow I was responsible for what took place, when so far as I know, I am the only person on the face of this planet who tried to prevent the confrontation, while the State Department, the FBI, and the CIA sent Congressman Ryan in there to his death, not knowing that he would be killed, but knowing that it was a real possibility that he would die, and many others would die. Because as we will see when we move into the facts on that question, that the State Department and the intelligence agencies knew everything about the problems in Jonestown and deliberately deceived Congressman Ryan. Had they told him the truth, I am convinced that he would not have gone there. In fact, after all of my objections to him and to his staff and to his aides, he arranged for a meeting with the State Department to find out if there was any validity to the points that I was making. And he was assured by the State Department, well, Lane's just the lawyer. Jones does not, you know, like anybody else. He doesn't want a congressional investigation. So they're telling you these things about provocation. But we know, and we can assure you of this, Congressman Ryan, said the State Department at a meeting just before they embarked for Georgetown. We can assure you of this. The only problems that you will run into in there is you will find that the food and the housing will not be up to your ordinary standards. No other problems. That's what the State Department told Congressman Ryan, and that's why he went. And that's why he disregarded my advice. Because the State Department said they knew more about it than I did, and they did. They knew a lot more than I did, but they did not share that information with him. When Terry Buford left, she was afraid that some action would be taken against her, that she might in fact even be killed by People's Temple for defecting. And so she left a note behind saying that she was going to infiltrate an organization called the Concerned Parents, Concerned Relatives, an organization set up by people who had relatives in there, a group which Jim Jones saw as the enemy, the group set up, as he felt, to destroy him and to destroy Jonestown. And she left word that she was going to infiltrate that group, which was very much directed by a man named Tim Stone, a lawyer from California. She said that because that group was based in Berkeley, California, and she was flying to New York, and she thought that would buy her some time, as she put it. Well, Jones was concerned about finding her, and so he sent Tim Carter from Jonestown into the Concerned Relatives organization in Berkeley, California, looking for Terry Buford. And when he got there and saw that she was not there, he did meet with Tim Stone, Mr. Jones's adversary. And Stone said, this is our plan. Ryan is going in there. He's going in with the news media. He's going in with some of the relatives from our organization. We're all going to walk in there together. If we get one person to defect from that organization, because the congressman will be there when it happens, NBC television will film it, and all the major press of America will be writing down the words, we will destroy Jonestown. We will destroy Jim Jones. And Tim Carter took that information back to Jim Jones, adding to his paranoia, adding to his fear that one person might leave, and if so, the entire operation would be destroyed. The congressman said he was going. And he was going just with one other congressman and 2 aides, 1 aide each. And when I gave that information back to People's Temple, they gave that to Jim Jones. Jones said that was not true. He said, the congressman is lying to you. We know from our person who infiltrated the Stone Group. They're going with the news media. They're going with relatives who are opposed to us. Their plan is to destroy us. And I was reassuring them that's not true. I was saying to the People's Temple exactly what Mr. Scholar had said to me. Well, anybody can fly on the plane from the United States to Georgetown, but there's no plan to bring them in. The congressman's aide has given me his word. And Jones was nervous, felt he was being betrayed at the outset by Congressman Ryan, maybe even by his lawyer. I was telling him one thing, his own intelligence was finding out something else. On Friday, November 17th, the day before the massacre, I met with Congressman Ryan for the first time at the hotel he was staying at in Georgetown, the capital of Guyana, the Pegasus Hotel. We went there with Charles Gary, who has been the lawyer for People's Temple, the only general counsel for People's Temple for the last 2 years, still is the attorney for People's Temple, the executor of Jim Jones's estate and the executor of Marcy Jones's estate, Jim Jones's wife, the attorney in all of the lawsuits filed by People's Temple and all the lawsuits filed against People's Temple, all Charles Gary. He went there, and I went there with 2 people from People's Temple to the congressman's office and met with him, with Jim Scarlett, who I met for the first time after having had numerous telephone conversations with him, and with Jackie Speier, who was an aide to Congressman Ryan and a lawyer. And I said, what are the plans for today? He said, well, we're going to be leaving here in 10 minutes. Now, there's a seat for Mr. Lane and a seat for Mr. Gary on the plane. And I said, who's going to be on the plane? I don't see Congressman Derwinski. No, he didn't come. Who will be going? Well, he said, I will be going with 1 aide, 9 members of the news media, and 4 members of the concerned relatives. I said, now, 1 second. I've been assuring Mr. Jones all along that you have told me, your office has told me that it's only the 2 members of Congress and 2 aides. He said, well, that was our plan. It's been changed. I said, Mr. Scarlett, did you give me your word that it was just going to be 2 members of Congress and 2 aides? He said, well, I didn't make a commitment to you. I said, you didn't. He said, I just told you that was our plan. Our plans have changed now. I said to Congressman Ryan, why have you changed your plans? Without even telling Jim Jones. I said, I told you he's ill. He's under heavy medication. He just saw the visit of 2 members of Congress and 2 aides as a provocation. How do you think he's going to see the whole news media being brought in by you? And the relatives who are suing him for millions of dollars, who've made hostile statements about him. How do you think he's going to view that? Ryan said the reason we changed our mind is because the American embassy, which we thought would get us a plane which held 6 passengers, has gotten us a plane which holds 18. And I'm selling tickets on the plane so that we don't have to build a House International Relations Committee for the use of the whole plane. I said, that's the reason? He said, that's right. And I said, I think you don't want to do this. I think you don't want to provoke a further response from Jim Jones. I said, but I'll tell you what, I will go back to the house in Georgetown with Mr. Gary, and we will communicate all of this information to Jim Jones, and he'll have to decide how he wants to respond, if he's going to let you all in or not. Because at this point, he has been assured that just the congressional delegation and no news media and no relatives. He said, well, we don't have time for that. We're leaving in 10 minutes from here. And I said, in other words, you just want to arrive there in Jonestown, having assured him that it would be a congressional delegation and no news media and no one else? You want to arrive with this whole delegation? He said, that's right. I said, you don't want to do that. That would be a really bad mistake. All of this was tape recorded, this whole conversation, whole exchange. I said, you really don't want to do that. He said, that's the way it's going to be. And I went downstairs and I told that to the news media. And I said, you know, I think he's going to see this as a terrible provocation, and I don't think this is the right way to do it. They became a little nervous at that point themselves. They had not been briefed by the State Department. They hadn't been told everything's fine. They were getting a little nervous, as was I. At that point, Jackie Speier came down and said, all right, you have 2 hours so you can communicate with Jones, but meet us at the airport in 2 hours. And so we went back, Charles Gary and I, to the People's Temple House and raised Jim Jones by radio in Jonestown and told him what the situation was. And he kept on saying, this is terrible, terrible, I don't know what to do, this is terrible. What should I do? And I said, I can't give you any advice. I can just tell you what seems to me to be a plan, and that is that I don't think they expect you to let anybody in. I think that's why they're doing it this way without telling you in advance. Oh, I should tell you this, that when I said, who are the 4 relatives who will be going in, Congressman Ryan said, I will not tell you. And I said, well, how can I tell Jim Jones what the delegation is? I said, you know, this is a private community. They don't have to let anybody in, a member of Congress or anybody else. It's not in the United States, it's a private community. And they've agreed to open their gates to you and let you look all over the place. But you keep on changing the rules, and he's going to be very upset. And I said, at least tell me who's coming in so I can tell him that. And he said, no, we're not going to tell you who the relatives are. I said, he's going to see them at the gate. He said, all right, you can see them there, but not before. Well, I tried to put the best face on it when I talked to Jim Jones. I said, 4 relatives will be coming in. He said, who are they? And I said, I don't know. They wouldn't say, but, you know, you'll see them before they go in. And he said, this is terrible. This is a betrayal. He said, he lied to you. He's been lying to us all along. What do you think they're planning? And I said, I don't know, but I can tell you that if you don't let them in, the congressman, of course, will be at the gate. The news media has traveled a long, long way for that moment. They're going to have a story, and it will be on film. NBC will run it in the very near future. Network News. Congressman Ryan trying to get in, being told by the people of Jonestown, you're not allowed in. The relatives saying, I want to see my sister, I want to see my brother, I want to see my child. All filmed with the press. They're writing it down. And that will all be very widely reported in the United States, and eventually, no doubt, there will be a congressional investigation based upon your refusal to let the congressman in. I said, but that depends on your timetable. If that's not a problem for you, that's fine. That's up to you. He said, well, what do you suggest? Well, I had no suggestions. Charles Gary came on and took a very firm position. You must let them in. There will be a catastrophe if you don't. I'm going back to San Francisco if you don't let them in. And he said, all right, all right. All right, we'll let them in. But this is very bad. They've lied to us. And that's the way the visit began. I was on the truck with Congressman Ryan. We drove into Jonestown together. Among the relatives who were present was one man who was suing People's Temple and Jonestown and Jim Jones for $15 million about conditions in Jonestown, and his suit was greatly aided by the fact that he could go in there and look around. He was brought in by Congressman Ryan. And Jones felt that that was a terrible thing for the Congress to have done. They looked around. I walked in with the congressman, introduced him to Marcy Jones, Jim Jones's wife, and she said, we would like to show you our health facility, our medical programs, our nursery school, our educational system, things we're very proud of. We know you've heard negative things about us. We'd like you to look at everything we have here. And he said, yes, I'll do that, but first I have a list of people I want to interview. And I want to interview them alone, just Jackie Spear and I. Where can we be where no one will hear what we have to say? And so in that same pavilion, where the next day many of the people were to die, Congressman Ryan was taken to a platform with a bench and a table and told he could remain there. And he reached into his pocket and said, here's a list of 7 people I want to see. I'd like them to be brought up here quickly, one at a time. That was a reasonable request. He had names from relatives. What was so unusual about it is that Richard McCoy of the American Embassy, the intelligence desk of the American Embassy, had been in there in the past. Let me give you a little background about that. There have been many complaints about People's Temple made by relatives to the American Embassy in the past, since People's Temple organized its Jonestown operation. And as the relatives made complaints, Lou Gervich, who I spoke about earlier, whose daughter Jan was in there, called Mr. McCoy and said, my daughter Jan is there. I think she may be kept there against her own wishes. I'm thinking, he said, I got 300 guys working for me. They all got guns. I'm thinking about going down there and getting my daughter out of there. He said, don't do a thing. Don't even visit her. I will visit her myself and let you know. And so Mr. McCoy went in sometime thereafter and conducted an interview with Jan Gervich and with several other people, and reported back to Mr. Gervich, she's fine, she's happy, it's a peaceful pastoral place, there's no basis for any of the complaints. That's where the story of the socialist utopia came from the assurances made by the United States government to the relatives of Jonestown. They vouched for it. No problems at all in there. People are happy, healthy, well-fed, no one wants to leave. Well, it does seem a little odd to me, retrospect, I think, to all of us. People lived there for 1.5 years, over 1,000 people. Almost nobody ever left. Now, people leave cities all the time. Families break up, yet nobody ever left there. And these are people from the large urban centers of the United States living in the middle of a jungle. Certainly there was a cultural shock. How come nobody wanted to leave? Well, the American embassy said they don't want to leave because they love it there. There are no problems at all. How did Mr. McCoy conduct his investigation? How did he interview people? The question is, are these people being held captive? Is Jim Jones and are the members of his staff the captors? That was the question. Mr. McCoy would submit the names of those he wanted to interview to Jim Jones 4 weeks in advance of the interview. In 4 weeks, I will want to talk to these people. Well, that gave Jim Jones 3 weeks to increase the quality of life, to improve the quality of life for those who were going to be questioned. And he did. Better food, better jobs, everyone was nice to him. And those who were single and had no sex partners, some of them was provided. And there everybody was in love. Everybody on the list was in love. 3 weeks before the inquiry, they didn't know that anybody was coming to see them. Everything was done to change and improve their lives. No one ever said a harsh word to them. They could actually genuinely say, you know, there are a lot of problems here, but the last 4 weeks, things have really been looking up here. But more than that, they were drilled during the last week about every question which could be put to them and what their answers must be. Jim Jones's most passionately committed follower was a woman named Maria Katsaris, and she was present during all of the interviews conducted in there. Now, Mr. McCoy had to know that those were interviews conducted without integrity. First, give the potential, the possible captor, the names 4 weeks in advance, and then allow the possible captor to have his aides sit in on all of the interviews. Well, Tom Reston, reported to the New York Times, he's from the State Department, explained it all. He said, well, we didn't conduct the best investigations, but after all, he said, our consulate people are not trained investigators. That may be so in general, but we were not talking about a general situation, but a specific one. Richard McCoy was an officer in the Office of Special Investigations of the United States Air Force Intelligence for 6 years, prior to becoming the intelligence officer of the American Embassy in Georgetown. And he kept on saying everything's fine. He said that to Lou Gurvich, don't come in here. And Gurvich said, if you ever find anything out, any evidence at all that there's a problem there, do you promise you will let me know? I'm really very concerned about my daughter, and I'll do anything I can to help her. The answer was yes. If we ever find any evidence of any wrongdoing, we will let you know about it, said Mr. McCoy. And to the relatives, he said, I hear all of these rumors about beatings and guns and all of these things, and people can't leave. But I see a happy, peaceful place. You all may be a little crazy, overreacting. Have one person defect from there. Give me first-hand evidence, not rumors, and we will take action. In May of 1978, Debbie Blakey, the third-ranking official of People's Temple in Jonestown, defected, and she called Richard McCoy from Georgetown and said, come get me, I want to go home. And this is what she told him. Jim Jones holds the lives of those people in his hand. He had a practice mass suicide ritual, which was really mass murder being planned, while I was there. It's an armed camp. There are 200 to 300 people with semi-automatic weapons, 25 pistols. They even have a homemade bazooka. There are terrible beatings in there. Many people want to leave but are not free to leave. And furthermore, when you conduct your investigation and give them 4 weeks' notice, they're drilled in advance. Based upon that information, the American Embassy later sent someone in there, giving People's Temple 5 weeks' notice of the names of the people they were going to question. She said, what will you do now? Debbie Blakey said, I'm concerned about the people in there. What can be done? I'm fearful for my own life. He said, well, you can go back to the United States. She said, yes, I'm doing that. And I'll keep my identity secret. I won't let people know where I'm staying. But what will you do? Mr. McCoy said, I ask you to do one thing, Debbie. You've told me the situation. I ask you when you go back to America, do not tell this to the American news media. And she went back to the United States, and for a month she did not tell that to the news media. But the government took no action. And so she told it to Malcolm Kilduff of the San Francisco Chronicle. And he ran a major story, Marshall Kilduff. He ran a major story with her picture across 3 columns, saying just what I said to you. It was picked up by the AEP and the UPI, sent to every newspaper, magazine, radio station, television station in America. In a remote jungle outpost, people are held, their lives are in jeopardy, 200 to 300 weapons. They practice a mass suicide ritual. They could be all killed at any time. That was in June of last year, sent to every newspaper in America. 200 to 300 semi-automatic weapons. All the details sent out by the AP and UPI all over America in June. There were no secrets about the problems there for anyone who was conducting an investigation to find out what the situation was. Certainly there were very powerful allegations of problems there. When Congressman Ryan, confronted with these stories and confronted with my plea that he not go to Georgetown and Jonestown, was briefed by many members of the State Department, including Mr. McCoy. He said, what's the story about all of this? He said, it's crazy. It's a peaceful place. No guns there. No problem there. But Debbie Blakey had told Mr. McCoy, that she saw 200 to 300. How could that be discounted? How could a United States congressman walk into that situation, into an armed camp of people led by someone whose mental status was at least in doubt? Now, I'm going to go back a little earlier to tell you what else the United States government knew. Tim Stone was the original attorney for People's Temple more than 7 years ago. And he has a very interesting background. Went on tour of the world for Rotary International, went to East Germany, and later wrote that he was arrested there by the Russian KGB in East Germany. That then, he said, his life was set forever because there he saw the grim, robot-like faces of the East Germans, the communists. And when he returned to West Germany, he saw the happy, smiling faces of the capitalists. And he realized then that he would dedicate his whole life to the total destruction of communism wherever he went. He wrote about this. Came back to the United States to dedicate his life to the destruction of communism, and went to see Jim Jones, who was an avowed leader of a communist organization, and said, I'd like to be your general counsel. Either Mr. Stone had suffered an immediate political and personality metamorphosis, or he was involved in a masquerade in claiming that he was a communist who wanted to assist Jim Jones. This is what Terry Buford stated. Unlike Esquire magazine or the New York Times or CBS News, which offered their own comments, Terry Buford testified under oath before a grand jury under penalty of perjury. And this is what she said. During the entire time when she first joined the temple, she was assigned by Jim Jones to be the legal aid to Tim Stone, who was the general counsel for the People's Temple for 7 years. She worked with him closely every day during that period. She said there was never a crime contemplated or committed by People's Temple, not one, which Tim Stone had not suggested, not initiated, or counseled them to go ahead with if someone else had suggested. Among the crimes he suggested, she said in her testimony, that we, the People's Temple, poisoned the water supply system of Washington, D.C., manufacture bombs in San Francisco. He was responsible, she said, for a kidnapping of an elderly man. And why was none of this detected when the temple was based in Ukiah, California? Because Tim Stone became the assistant district attorney of Ukiah, California, and utilized that position to prevent an investigation into the very crimes that at nighttime he was proposing, and during the daytime covering up as an assistant DA. Then the People's Temple moved to San Francisco because Ukiah was not congenial politically. A racist community with no blacks living there, vast majority of the people, People's Temple being black, they moved to San Francisco, to a more tolerant area. Just like that, Mr. Stone became the assistant district attorney in San Francisco as well. And Jim Jones would address his followers on occasion and say, I know some of you don't like the discipline that you've subjected yourself to, the spankings, the beatings. He said, but if any of you complain to the police, remember this: before the police can take action, we have an assistant DA, and he will report back to us about your complaint. Terry Buford testified that, in fact, Tim Stone arranged for the kidnapping of an elderly man from an old age home in Ukiah, California, man who was bad-mouthing Tim Stone. Had him kidnapped and taken down to Los Angeles and put in the People's Temple old age home. And when the woman who owned the home, Bertie Maribel, went to the district attorney's office in Ukiah to complain that this man had been kidnapped, she was referred to Tim Stone, and she fled in terror. And that evening, Tim Stone called Jim Jones and said, well, she came in, you should have seen her jaw drop. There's nothing they can do as long as I have this position. Is it about time somebody looked into the question of the use of law enforcement in these areas? Other bizarre things were happening. Two of the defectors from the People's Temple, who had informants in People's Temple, discovered that there was going to be a large shipment of guns, those guns which were down there later and played a part in the murders. They were going to be shipped down in large crates containing medical supplies, but there were going to be false bottoms. And they gave that information to the San Francisco Police Department and to the United States Customs authorities and to the Treasury Department. And they took no action. And their records reveal this now. We've gotten those documents, that those complaints were made, and they took no action. The government, knowing that guns were being shipped illegally to Jonestown, took no action. They knew those guns were going to be there even before Mr. McCoy knew that they had been placed there. One of the most bizarre aspects of this incredible story is that one day Tim Stone, according to his own affidavit, went to see Jim Jones and said, you know, my wife, his wife, Grace Stone, really loves you, Jim, and our life would be complete if you became the father of her child. And he has said this already in an affidavit. And the act evidently took place, and sometime later, John Stone was born. Now, Jim Jones had a very possessive attitude, to put it very mildly, about not only all of the members of his flock, but certainly about his own flesh and blood. And Grace Stone left People's Temple and left her child behind. And Jim Jones raised that child as his own. It was his child. He raised that child. And he was afraid at one point, when great criticism was beginning to develop in San Francisco about him, that an effort would be made by Grace Stone to take the child back. And so he went to his lawyer, Tim Stone, the husband of the mother, and said, what can I do to make sure that I never lose John? And Tim said, look, you're the father. I'll tell you what you can do. I've done a lot of research. This is according to the testimony of Terry Buford. I've done a lot of research. And I've discovered that if you go to Jonestown, a community which was thriving and existing and doing a lot better then before Jim Jones got there than it did afterwards. If you go down there, he said, I've checked the extradition treaties. No action can be brought which will ever successfully extradite John from Guyana to the United States. He said, even if I tried to do the same thing with Grace together, you could never lose the child if you're there. And based upon that advice, Jim Jones went to Jonestown. That's why he went there, based upon the advice of his attorney. Before going, he said, listen, Tim, you know what will happen? If Grace ever tries to get this child back, I will kill the child, and I'll kill myself, and all of us will die in Jonestown. I will never, never allow this child to be taken from me. Tim Stone knew that Jim Jones meant that. He had known him for 7 years. Tim Stone went down to Jonestown, left his child behind, the child behind, came back to the United States. While he was down there, Jones told him on more than one occasion, if there's ever any effort which looks like it will be successful to take this child from me, I'll kill the child and myself, and we will all die here. That's the principle. Quoted Dr. King. If you're not willing to die for what you believe in, then you're not really living anyway. Taking it somewhat out of context and distorting the meaning, of course, but utilizing that basis for his position. Stone said, I understand that. Stone went back to the United States, left the People's Temple, and initiated a custody action to acquire custody of John Stone, knowing what Jim Jones might do. And he was not living with Grace Stone, and he was not the father. It's hard to understand why he brought that action. He had left the child behind, didn't try to have the child leave with him, but brought a legal action. Jones was very, very nervous about that suit and hired counsel, the finest lawyer in Georgetown, to represent him. Stone spent a lot of money for the suit. I understand he spent $25,000 to one lawyer in Georgetown, which is a lot of money for any lawsuit and an awful lot of money by Guyanese standards, I assure you. Made the lawyer, received it, almost a millionaire by Guyanese standards. It's a very, very poor country, Guyana. And an order was issued on the very day that the leadership of Guyana was no longer in the country. Deputy Prime Minister was in the United States. Other leaders were in various other places, leaving behind the fourth person in the power structure who was very hostile to People's Temple as the person in charge of the country at that moment. And when the order was served on Jonestown personnel, requiring them to surrender John John, in October 1977, Jim Jones radioed Terry Buford, who was running the radio in San Francisco, the People's Temple office, and said, "They're coming for John John. I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill myself. And we're all going to die here." Now, that was not said privately in a telephone conversation, but by radio. It was monitored by the Federal Communications Commission, by the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They've now conceded they knew all about that radio call, but it was not just one. It went on for hour after hour after hour. And Terry was almost panicked. She knew that he meant it. He gathered everyone together in the pavilion, had them surrounded. The poison was being prepared. That was no idle threat, and Terry Buford knew it. And she just thought, who can I get who can persuade him that this is the wrong thing, dissuade him from this conclusion? Huey Newton, the Black Panther Party, brought in and was involved in a long radio conversation with Jim Jones saying, don't do this. And he said, well, you wrote this book, Revolutionary Suicide. And Huey said, that's not what I meant. He said, I want to tell you something, Jim. You kill those people down there. That's not revolutionary suicide. That is genocide against black people. You cannot do that. And as firm as he was, Huey Newton, he was cautious, thinking that this man's insane. I can only go so far. I don't want to alienate him. I want to move him to the position where he'll stop. Angela Davis was brought in. She, too, was involved in radio conversation, begging Jim Jones not to do it. Dennis Banks of the American Indian Movement, same thing. All begging him not to do it. In the meantime, there was a desperate search for Deputy Prime Minister Reed, who was in the United States, and they located him. And Marcy Jones flew to where he was that same day, told him what the situation was, and begged him to authorize the statement that John John will not be taken away. And just before the massacre was about to take place in October 1977, the Deputy Prime Minister Reed gave his word. That was communicated to Jim Jones, and he called off the massacre. Now, all of that was known to the State Department, and the fact that since that time they had acquired 200 to 300 semi-automatic weapons, and that Jones had been driven to distraction. And yet they said to Congressman Ryan, go in there, perfectly safe. And when Ryan said to Mr. McCoy, in essence, said to the State Department, when I go in there, I want to take out this list and show it to them, the names of the people. Is that going to cause a problem? Oh, no. Mr. McCoy does that all the time. Because he never did anything like that. He said, I want to be alone with him. That's fine. McCoy does that all the time. So he showed the list that day, the evening, Friday evening, November 17th, and people were brought up one at a time and talked to the congressman. And the leadership of Jonestown was terrified that one person might defect. They kept on saying, if one person goes, we'll be destroyed. I didn't know what they were talking about. I didn't know that Tim Carter had learned that from Tim Stone. That was a Tim Stone strategy. No one had told me that at that time. I learned it a little later that evening. Jones kept saying it. Harriet Trapp, who was a law graduate, who was one of his advisors, kept saying that. Johnny Jones, his adopted son, kept saying that. That evening, if one person goes, we'll be destroyed. And I said, no, you won't. What does that mean? Suppose half the people go home. What difference does it make? Half the people want to stay, half the people want to go home. The ones that want to go home should go home. What's wrong with that? No, if one person goes, we'll be destroyed. They kept on saying that, and none of it made any sense. In any event, he had gone through the list of 7, and everyone said they were quite content there. And the leadership heaved a sigh of relief. And then he took out another list of 8 more, and another list, and another list, and another list. Later that evening, a dinner was made available to all of the guests, Congressman Ryan and the others, and everybody ate everything that was served. We all drank a great deal of what the press refers to as Kool-Aid. They're even wrong about that. Kool-Aid was not utilized down there. It was made by another company in another country. It's called Flavor Aid. And that was served. Everybody ate and drank that, including me. We all ate everything that was available. The food was quite good, as a matter of fact, for the guests that evening. And a performance was had. Just marvelous singing and acting and dancing, a musical program, quartet, great humor. Almost all the words were original. Most of the music was original as well. And Congressman Ryan very much enjoyed it. And then he was called upon to speak. Congressman got up there before 1,000 Americans and said, you know, he was unlike most of the other members of Congress who are lawyers, he was a teacher. He said, you know, I've heard a lot of charges about this place before I came here, but I've looked around at it, and I've met 2 of my former students here already, and many of the people I've talked to have said that the greatest thing that ever happened to them in their lives was Jonestown. And there's a great ovation at that point. He sat down smiling. And things seemed to be going very well at that point. It appeared that there might not be a serious confrontation. It was out of a fear of a confrontation that I had gone there. James R. Ray's testimony had been canceled without any explanation by the House Select Committee, and the People's Temple called me and said, we saw on television that you don't have to be in Washington. Now can you go down to Jonestown? And I met with Terry Buford and with April Ferguson, who's my law partner and dear friend. And I said, what should I do? They want me to go down there. And April said, don't go. I said, why do you think I shouldn't go? And she said, because, you know enough now to know that Jim Jones is sort of crazy. And therefore, you never know what a crazy person will do. Therefore, it's better not to be around him. And I said, Terry? She said, well, you know, I love those people. They're all my friends and all my family, 1,000 of them. I've known them for 7 years. They're marvelous people, almost all of the people there. She said, I don't think there will be any problem. I mean, after all, she said, when I last saw Jim Jones in September 18th, I said to him, there is a campaign to drive you crazy, Jim, to make you pull off this white knight, this mass suicide, and you must resist it. He said, oh, I know that. She said, Jones said, I know that. I know that's their game plan. I'll never fall for it. I'll never do it. And she said, the fact that he said that they would never do anything, the fact that he had never harmed anybody in the outside of the organization, no one, that he's been very, very careful about the press, about anyone in Congress, about any lawyer, anyone who was not a member of the organization, that those who accepted the discipline of People's Temple were one thing. Those outside had never been harmed. No one had ever been hit or pushed. She said that, you know, she couldn't conceive of him doing anything to harm anybody with the congressman and the news media there. And she said, you know, but if something comes up, if there is a problem of some kind, she said, Mark, I think you're the one person who can sort of smooth things over because he knows you're not an agent of the government. You've fought them for so many years in the Kennedy and King cases. He has respect for you for doing that. And she said, I just think there's not going to be a problem, but if there is, I think more than anyone else, you may be able to stop it if anything develops. But I'm sure that nothing will happen to you or to the other guests there. And April said, how can you be sure if he's crazy? She said, well, I can't be sure, but I'm almost sure. And based upon that and her plea that I might be able to be of some value there, I went to Jonestown. And I was in Washington when it was finally decided that Ray was not going to testify finally, and I was wearing a suit. I was dressed, you know, you dress differently for Congress, a congressional committee in November, from the way you would be dressed in the middle of a tropical jungle, of course. In other words, there's different kinds of clothing depending upon the jungle that you're appearing in. And suit and a tie for one and something less formal for another. And I had no clothing to take down to Jonestown. I did a little shopping in a Washington department store, and one of the things I bought was 6 pair of white shorts. I didn't expect to be away from home for so long. I'm not going to burden you with my entire shopping or laundry list. It's just that this becomes somewhat relevant later in the narrative. And I had a little case in which I kept my toilet articles and some of the shorts and some of the other things that I bought, little shoulder bag. So I took down there with me. Friday night passed, and it appeared there was no provocation. Congressman Ryan went to sleep late at night, so did Jackie Speier, so did a man from the Ministry of Information of Guyana who was in there, and the relatives and the press went back to Port Kaituma for lodgings which had been arranged there. And Charles, Gary, and I shared a little room in Jonestown. But before we retired, Jones said he wanted us to hear something, and then arranged for a little meeting of perhaps a dozen or less people in that pavilion. And Jim Jones said, "All right, Tim, tell them what Stone told you," talking to Tim Carter. And he told us how he'd gone to the center. And Tim Stone said, if one person defects, one person leaves, Jonestown and Jim Jones will be totally and completely destroyed. At that point, Jones was shaking. His hands were trembling. And I said, listen, Jim, that's what Tim Stone, who you say is your enemy, that's what he wants you to believe. But that's not true. If half the people leave, it doesn't mean anything. It means that half the people want to go home. How does that deal with the integrity of this operation? Half people want to stay, half people want to go. I said, listen, Jim, you know, people are married for 25 years and one spouse leaves the other. Children grow up and they leave their family. People move from one country to another. People quit their jobs after 10 or 15 or 20 years. That's not a betrayal. I said, you say you're a Marxist. You know about dialectical materialism. Things are always in a state of flux and change. There are always contradictions. It's amazing that people would be here for a year and a half and nobody would leave. Almost nobody would leave. There's nothing wrong with someone leaving. And he said, if one person leaves, we'll be destroyed. How do we know that one person, maybe even an agent in here, will pretend to defect and will be destroyed? I said, no, that's what Tim Stone wants you to believe. But it was hopeless. He had that thought. It had been implanted in him by Tim Stone, who was a close, intimate contact of his. Together they had run the People's Temple for 7 years and had a close, continuing, intimate relationship. And Stone knew which buttons to push. And he pushed that appropriate button for that appropriate response, and it was there. It was very difficult to dislodge. Well, that was Friday night, and things had gone fairly well. The congressman was impressed with some of the things that he had seen, and perhaps concerned about other things, but if he was not talking about them. The next morning, we had breakfast, and then went out into the day, and a number of problems immediately confronted us. The word got around 2 people were leaving. 2 people had told the congressman that they were going to leave. And when that happened, I went to Harriet Tropp, who gave me the news, this young law graduate. And she said, 2 people are leaving, 2 people are leaving. And I said, I think that's great. She said, what? I said, sure. I mean, the people who want to leave should leave. And if nobody left, it would seem very strange to me. After a year and a half, if people want to leave, I think it's fine. And she looked at me and she screamed, you're crazy, you're crazy. That terminated the discussion at that point, and she walked away. But that was the atmosphere which was existing at that time. And then Charles Kraus of the Washington Post, who was perhaps the most ill-informed person in the entire operation, certainly of the news media, insisted upon going into one building called Jane Pittman Gardens. Up until that point, the leadership was panicked about fear that someone might leave or something might be discovered, but the people who lived there weren't concerned at all, so far as I could see. Nobody seemed at all concerned. Everybody was friendly and relaxed and low-key and went about their business. Until the Jane Pittman Garden episode. Charles Kraus went there. He did not know. No one had told him anything about Jonestown or People's Temple. I think the Washington Post was almost criminally negligent in sending that fool in there, completely unaware of any of the circumstances. He went right up to the building and he said, I want to go in, I want to look around this building. And the people, they're all elderly women in there, said, we don't want you to come in. He said, I'm with the Washington Post. They said, well, then we certainly don't want you to come in here. And he started saying, I have the right to go in there. I have a right to visit all this place. I was told that I could see anything I wanted to see. Why can't I get in there? By now, the news media had just about finished its work. And they were going on a tour with Marcy Jones, finally, of the nursery school, of the medical program. Medical program was a remarkable program. I'm not painting for you a paradise. I tell you, people were eating rice and working very long, hard hours. And at first, it was a benign dictatorship, which turned into a mad dictatorship, which made life very, very difficult. But there were positive things that existed there, which is why the people went there in the first place. There was a medical program there. I talked to one woman who had high blood pressure, a woman in her 60s on the West Coast, black woman. She had high blood pressure. She had her blood pressure checked 3 times a day in that place. 70 medical workers, 70 for 1,000 people. They took care of 200 to 300 Amerindians Indians who came in from the interior each week. She said to me, you know, I have my blood pressure checked 3 times a day. For her, the rice diet actually was effective because it was bringing it down. She said, you know, when I lived in the United States, I didn't have my blood pressure checked 3 times in 60 years in America. I talked to a man who had crippling arthritis. He said he would drag himself to his neighborhood clinic in a hospital and wait there in a ghetto area and wait and wait and wait. And finally, if he was examined often, he would get nothing but aspirin. He said, down here, I get really fine medical treatment. I talked to a woman there who had 3 children. I asked her why she was there. And she said, because I have 3 children, one of whom is now just about high school age, and we live in Watts, Los Angeles. She said, if by some miracle all 3 of them graduate from high school, she said, and with the problems of this community, unemployment about 80% among black young people, terrible crime problems, heroin available. She said, if it would be a miracle if they graduate, but if they did all graduate, I know they would not be able to read and write. They'd be functionally illiterate. And the statistics support that, unfortunately. In ghetto schools all around this country, not just Watts, but East Harlem and Harlem, south side of Chicago, all around this country. That is a fact. She said, that's why we came here. Well, now for the first, and they had built an educational system, better than most public educational systems in the large cities of America, accredited by the Guyanese educational system. There's a man named Richard Trop, who was considered to be a near genius at the University of Rochester. They were building a whole academic program around him after he came back from his Woodrow Wilson Fellowship. He left, went down there to teach. They had remarkable teachers all over that place. And so these were the positive aspects which led the people there. And now, finally, the Congress and some of the news media were seeing the positive aspects of life so they could have some kind of a balanced story. And there was Charles Kraus demanding the right to go in, and all the media left all the other things they were doing and went over the House. And I heard from one of the members of the news media, well, they found the place where Jim Jones's goons have people at gunpoint. The recalcitrants are being held at gunpoint so that the news media and the congressman can't see them. So I went running over the House, and that was Jane Pittman Gardens. And I went running over there, and all the news media was gathered there. By now, Don Harris had come with his TV crew, and all the other media was there. Tim Reiterman of the San Francisco Examiner was there. And Johnny Jones, Jim Jones' adopted son, was very angry and said, you don't have the right to go in. These people live there. They don't want you to come into their homes. Kraus said, we have the right because we were told we know what's going on in there. And finally, Tim Reiterman said, well, if it's just a question of privacy, how do these people in there feel about Mark? And Johnny said, well, they like him a lot. He talked about the King case, and he's got a lot of friends here. Over 100 people have written to me from Jonestown after I spoke there, thanking me for having spoken there. And he said, people like him a lot. Why? And Tim Reiterman said, if you let Mark Lane walk in there, if they'll let him go in there, and he says, nobody's got a gun, and people just don't want to talk with us, we will accept that as a fact. And he said, all right. And he asked the people how they felt about that, and the women said, fine. So I walked in there. It was a crowded facility, a lot of elderly people, all of them were women, most of them were black. And I walked around and said, look, the news media's out. There was nobody with a gun in there. I said, the news media wants to talk with you. Do you want to talk with them? And each one said no. I asked each person. Then I went out and said, I didn't see any guns in there. And the women said they don't want to talk to you. And the news media said, well, all right, that's what you say. You are their lawyer. I knew they wouldn't be satisfied with that, but that's what they suggested, so that's what I did. And then I took Johnny Jones aside and said, look, it's crowded. Maybe you don't want them to see how crowded the facility is, but I tell you this, what's in their mind is a lot worse than a crowded facility. They think that, they don't believe me. They think that people with guns in there holding people silently so they can't tell the truth about Jonestown. And I said, I think you're better off letting them go in there, trying to persuade the people that would be all right. And he said, all right. He went in and talked to people, and they said, okay. And so the media made a tour, and they were satisfied that there's nobody there with a gun, and all the rumors that they had started and fabricated were untrue. But they saw that it was a crowded facility. And they came out and started talking about how crowded it was in there. And some of the black women came out and said, where are you coming from? Where do you come from? And he said, the San Francisco Examiner. She said, I used to live in San Francisco in the Fillmore area. You should have seen how crowded my apartment was there. And with rats and roaches, too. Not far from your office. You never came to my house then. You never talked about the crowded conditions that black people and other minority groups were forced to live in San Francisco, in the ghettos. But you come thousands of miles to follow us here, to embarrass us here. Why is that? And now, for the first time, not just the leadership, but the people in Jonestown were becoming angry with the news media. He said, well, we felt we had the right to go into... She said, well, would I have the right to go to your home? Can I fly to San Francisco today? Can I walk into your home and look around in all your rooms? See how crowded it is? See how you live? Do I have that right? And so it became a very angry exchange with a number of people involved in that exchange with people from the news media. A little bit later, and that created a very bad situation, because it's now not just the leadership, but people who live there becoming very angry. A little later that day, I was talking to Congressman Ryan when he said to me, the Parks family, a family of 6 people, had decided to leave. And Jim Jones was very upset about it. And Jones went over and started talking to them, gesticulating wildly. I was with the congressman some yards away, talking with him. We'd become quite friendly during that period of time. And he said, you know, we couldn't hear what Jones was saying, but it was clear, it seemed clear that he was begging them not to go. And Congressman Ryan said, you know, Jim Jones is a genius who built this place. Took someone like that to do this. But he's also the worst enemy this place could have. I mean, one of the things I'm supposed to be investigating and I want to find out about is whether people have a right to leave. Now, he's not pointing a gun at them, but look at the pressure he must be putting on them to stay, and that's wrong. And I said, I know, that's wrong. After a while, Jones called me over, and he said, Mark, the Parks family has decided to stay, and they want to talk with you. So I went over and talked with them, and the father was Jerry Parks, his son was Dale, and there were 4 other members of the family there. And Jerry and Dale said, we have a lot of sympathy for Jim Jones. This was his dream, but the thing has failed. We can't produce any food. The whole project's hopeless. And it's too many hours work. I'm tired. I don't have any decent food. I want to go home. We all want to go home. And I said, yeah. He said, but Jim says if we leave with the congressman, with the American embassy, with all of the press here and everything, that will be very destructive. And we've agreed. We don't want to go out with the government. We want to go out. Jim says we can leave next week. I said, okay. He said, but listen, you're the person we trust here. We want you to prepare a letter which says that we can leave in 1 week, and we want you to sign it, and we want Jim Jones to sign it. Will you do that? And I said, yes, I'll prepare such a letter and sign it and give it to you. And I could have left it at that, but I thought that that was not an honest thing to do without telling him my feeling about the instrument that he wanted me to prepare. And I said, I'll do that. But look, I got to tell you this. If you're free to come and go at any time, you don't need the letter, right? And they said, that's right. And I said, if you're not free to come and go, I don't think this letter will do you any good. First of all, I won't be here next week. I'm leaving tomorrow. And secondly, and maybe first of all, maybe that's secondly, maybe first of all, is the fact that even if I were here, that letter might be useless. But in my absence, I think it very well will be useless. So Jerry and Dale said, what can we do? And I said, well, there's Dwyer of the American Embassy. He had replaced Mr. McCoy, who had become the Guyana desk of the State Department by then. And I said, let's bring Dwyer over and brief him and see if he'll be here next week. And we told him what the situation was, and Dwyer said, yes, I'll be back here in 3 months. At which point, the young man in the family threw his arms up in the air and shouted, I will not wait 3 months. And I guess that's what it was that attracted Jim Jones, although I didn't see him come at that time. And he came over toward us. And Jerry Parks said to me, what should we do, Mark? And I said, if you want to leave, why don't you leave? And I looked up and saw Jim Jones had joined the group and was staring at me. And it appeared to me that if ever I had seen a death warrant in someone's eyes, I saw it then. And I've thought about that since that time. Of course, I've relived that moment on numerous occasions, and I don't know what the proper thing to do was. I do know if the situation arose again, identical situation, I would have done the same thing. My whole life has been devoted to movements for national liberation here at home and every other place that I've ever been able to operate. And I could not lie to someone and encourage them to stay in on false pretenses. So I would have done the same thing again. How much that affected Jim Jones at that point, I don't know. Sometime thereafter, when I was talking to Congressman Ryan, a man who I had never seen before came before Congressman Ryan, came up to him. Or I should tell you, just before that, Don Harris of NBC Television said, "I have to tell you something. We're leaving on the truck. We're going out down to Port Kaituma Airstrip and flying back to Georgetown, then to the United States." And I said, "Yes, I'm staying an extra day." He said, "Why are you staying?" I said, "Because Congressman Ryan has asked me to stay because he's processing people out and there are more people who may want to leave, and he's asked me to stay another day." He said, "Don't stay." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, last night when I was in Port Kaituma, I discovered from the police there that there are automatic weapons here. I don't think it's safe for you, Mark. Come on back with us." And I said, "Well, that's not good news. Are you sure?" He said, "Oh, yeah, there are automatic weapons." I said, "Well, that's not good news, but look, Don, I came here hoping there would be no trouble, thinking that if there was any trouble, maybe I could be useful. Now you're talking about something which indicates a greater possibility of trouble. I can't go. That's what I came for." And he begged me to go with him, thinking that there was safety on that truck. And I said no, I was going to stay. And of course, the great irony is he left, and Congressman Ryan left eventually on that truck. And they both died as soon as they arrived at the Port Kaituma airstrip. After Harris left to go onto the truck, waiting for people to go, I was talking to the congressman, and a man came behind him, tall man. Ryan and I both were, I'm 6 feet, he was about 6 feet, he's quite heavy. And this man came behind me, he was about 3 or 4 inches than either of us. He put his arm, one arm around his throat from the back, the other hand he held like this and swung around like this and knocked the congressman down in this position. And he held him there. And he said, "You motherfucker, I'm going to kill you." And the congressman said, "Oh, that's enough fooling around. Want to cut that out now?" And from that response, I thought that the congressman must know him. It seemed like it. And I looked, is that Jim Scollard? I mean, I couldn't believe it. First of all, it was a stupid thing to do if it was his closest friend. In the atmosphere which existed then, that was not going to be helpful. But the congressman was so low-key about it, I thought he must know him. And he had